It was late September 1955. Elias was behind the wheel of the old van he had rented for a week-long camping trip he planned with his friends. As the van shook and bumped along the winding, dusty path, he muttered, "This was not a great idea." The expression on his face was a mix of nervousness and suppressed disappointment. Caleb, in the passenger seat, was flipping through adult magazines he'd bought at the market and simultaneously finishing the food in the bag. "Don't be ridiculous, Elias. This is an escape ticket from the city, from classes, from that suffocating family of yours, the place where you said you'd clear your mind." Caleb's voice was cheerful, lively, and carefree. His friend's cynical attitude made Elias feel like he was the only one who was aware of his responsibilities. Despite being close for years, it was as if no one truly knew him. Dustin, sitting in the back, was always quiet. He made quick but neat scribbles in the notebook he never let out of his sight, no matter where he went. When he closed the notebook, he looked over the heavy, forested road. "This place is nice," he continued with a smile. "It reminds me of horror movies where killers are hunting." Caleb let out a short laugh. "Dude, you know your horror movie addiction scares the girls away, right?" He looked back and caught Dustin rolling his eyes. "What?" "Don't be mad at me. I'm telling you for your own good. You've been alone for years. It makes you look like more of a freak than you are." Before Dustin could open his mouth to reply, Elias cut in. "Caleb, stop talking nonsense and hand me a cigarette." Minutes later, the three friends, enveloped in silence, were driving deeper into a nearly forgotten forest in the northeast of New England. Elias's father had mentioned that an old cabin in the area was for rent, and that it might be an ideal place for some peace and quiet. But now, under the dense atmosphere of the forest, those words seemed like nothing more than a fabrication. The trees were so dense, the branches so intertwined, that the sunlight seemed to die before touching the dirt road. The air was colder than normal. This felt less like a sanctuary and more like an animal trap pulling you in. Elias glanced at the map in front of him. The cabin should be after this bend. When he turned the wheel to the right, the road got even worse. Luckily, he didn't have to go much further before the van's headlights illuminated the strange structure that was disappearing amongst the trees. The cabin resembled an abandoned soul, surrounded by wild berry bushes. The roof of the structure was unusually crooked. Some of the windows were cracked, and the porch planks were moldy. The vines and mushrooms covering the walls gave it an unhealthy look. Caleb got out of the van and walked toward Dustin. "Wow! Just the cheerful camping spirit we were looking for," he said with a cynical laugh, wrapping his arm around Dustin's shoulder. However, a suppressed unease was hidden behind that smile. Elias sighed deeply at the sight and then got out of the car. The silence outside was so different from the endless noise of New York that the noise in his own mind suddenly became more pronounced. He promised himself just 1 week. They began unloading their belongings from the van. Camping gear, the canned food that Caleb had already finished a few of, Dustin's drawing supplies, and Elias's heavy bag of medical books were now on the ground. Caleb was tasked with carrying all the belongings because he had been chattering the whole way. When they arrived at the cabin, the wooden door opened with a painful shriek. The inside smelled of mold. Elias looked up, trying to figure out where the roof was leaking, while the others brought the items inside. The layer of dust on the floor was proof that no living creature had set foot here for a long time. Although everything was dusty and old, the inside of the house was nicer than the outside. The large fireplace that almost covered the right wall looked quite comfortable with the two wide armchairs in front of it. The kitchen was separated from the living room by a half wall. The restroom was located immediately to the left of the wooden stairs leading upstairs. Even though it wasn't evening yet, it was quite dark inside. Caleb lit the gas lamp and walked towards the wide table almost in the center of the house. He wiped the dust off with his arm and placed the lantern on the table. The flickering yellow light cast eerie shapes onto the wall with the shadows. "Come on, let's get some whiskey out and make this ruin feel like home," he said, making sure his voice sounded brave. Dustin stood in the middle of the room, inhaling the moldy air inside the cabin. An unnatural coldness had seeped into his bones the moment he stepped inside. He shivered. Still, he thought that if it was fixed up a bit, it wouldn't be a bad place. He turned his eyes to the twilight seeping through the crack in the window pane. "Elias," he said. His voice was unusually soft. "It doesn't look like the former owners moved out." He paused briefly, then continued. "It's like they fled." "Isn't that the same thing?" Elias asked, rummaging through his backpack. "No, look around." Elias raised his eyebrows in curiosity and spun around. "I don't see anything strange," he said. Caleb joined the conversation while preparing the whiskey glasses. "Dustin, take a small break from spoiling the mood and hand me that whiskey bottle, brother." Dustin grabbed the yellow liquid from the bag and continued talking excitedly. "No, you don't understand. Things are just left around. It's like people ran away in a hurry without packing up. Look at this," he said, pointing to the children's toys next to the fireplace. "Why would they leave their children's belongings here? And there's more." Dustin was excited, as if he had solved a mystery. In response, Elias's mood was clearly spoiled, evident from the deep breath he took. He moved away from his backpack and surveyed the room. Indeed, many everyday items were simply abandoned. "Maybe we should go back," Elias said. Caleb smiled while taking food out next to the filled glasses. "You two read too many stories. This is just an old hunting cabin. Now drop the stories and let's get warm." After an exhausting day of tidying up the cabin, sunlight that had escaped the clutches of the dense forest air illuminated the room. With no time left to explore the upstairs rooms, the three of them had collapsed onto the armchairs in front of the lit fireplace and fallen asleep. As soon as Elias opened his eyes, he prepared a strong coffee. This was a behavior stemming from his study habit. As soon as he had his drink, he was studying the confusing symptoms and medical terms, arranging his textbooks on the table, taking care not to wake anyone up. Since disappointing his father and dropping out of university, his studying didn't really have a purpose. He had left his major due to an inner moral conflict. Nevertheless, studying felt like a safe space for Elias. When it was almost noon, Caleb and Dustin woke up and ventured into the forest to collect firewood. "The coldness I felt in the middle of the room wasn't normal," Dustin said, reluctantly swinging the axe in his hand. "I couldn't sleep at all last night. I kept feeling like someone was watching us." Caleb laughed. "Classic Dustin. Sounds from the forest, owls, the wind. You haven't been out of the Halloween mood for a week. Your brain is playing tricks on you." As Caleb bent down to stack the wood he had cut, he suddenly stopped. There was something shiny in the darkened sludge-like dirt. He reached out and picked it up. It was a small, wooden doll. Its face was crudely carved, its eyes empty and expressionless. However, what was striking was the small metal cross attached to his chest with a thin wire. "Look at this," Caleb said, swinging the object in his hand. "Why would a kid bring a toy this deep into the forest?" Dustin's color drained. It was as if his soul was stuck in his throat, about to leave his body. "Throw it away, Caleb." "What's wrong, Dustin?" Caleb tossed the toy in his hand into the air and quickly caught it again with a swift hand movement. The corner of his lips curled slyly. "Is the doll cursed? Or is your imagination working overtime?" Dustin quickly walked toward Caleb to grab the toy. Using the advantage of his height difference, Caleb raised his hand, preventing his friend from reaching the wooden doll. "If you want it, you have to come and get it." "Stop joking. Just throw it away," Dustin hissed. Not just his voice, but his whole body was trembling. He reached up on his toes, snatched the doll, and flung it into a nearby tree hollow. "This is a strange place, Caleb. I don't want you messing around with weird charmed objects." When they returned with the logs, the atmosphere in the cabin was tense. Elias was at the table. He was turning the pages of his books but not reading anything. With empty eyes, he seemed to be contemplating the life he had left behind, miles away. "Are you okay?" Dustin asked. Elias slowly lifted his head. There was a darkness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "This cabin, there's something strange. It's like the shadows are moving." Caleb adjusted the gas lamp to get a clearer view of the room. He laughed and sighed. "Look, I love you guys," he continued, raising his voice a bit. "But you're starting to get annoying. What's your problem for 2 days now?" "The lamp's just running low on gas. That's why the light was flickering, so don't worry, Elias. A random shadow won't reach out from the wall and eat you." "Look." Elias pointed his finger at the wall Caleb had just illuminated. "These aren't random scratches. Something or someone scratched them." The three friends approached the wall in the flickering light of the lamp. On the lower part of the wall, at shoulder height, very thin, almost invisible words scratched into the wood with nails caught their attention. Elias narrowed his eyes and read, "He doesn't want to see me. Where is my son? Lock the door." At the very bottom, there was a symbol carved deeper than the others, an arrow inside a circle. Caleb shivered. This was no longer a normal hunting cabin. Traces of despair had been carved into the wall. "All right, we're leaving now," Elias said, his voice determined. "We can't," Dustin said, his face pale. His hand trembled as he touched the symbol on the wall. "This symbol. It's an old superstition that brings bad luck. We have to erase it before we can go back." "Nonsense," Elias said. "It's not," Dustin snapped. "The forest knows." Elias, torn between his logic and his emotions, grabbed his backpack. Even though his best friend insisted, he knew he couldn't stand staying in the forest any longer. He grabbed his jacket from the chair and bolted outside. The sun had already begun to set. He forced open the van's door and reached into his pocket to leave as soon as possible. The key was gone. "Caleb, where did you put the keys?" Caleb frantically checked his pockets. I put them on the table, right here." The three of them ran back inside the cabin. The top of the table was empty, the books, the lamp, the whiskey bottle. Everything was in place except for the key. Darkness had fallen. The forest maintained its silence. It was as if no living thing inhabited it, and the darkness swallowed the characteristic noise of nature. Elias would have preferred the noise of the city to this menacing tranquility. The silent forest clearly wasn't going to let them leave today. The three friends lit the fireplace and slumped to the floor in front of it in despair. Dustin had pulled his knees to his chest, burying his head in his hands. Elias looked into Caleb's eyes and hissed, "This doesn't make sense." Dustin, swaying slightly where he sat, strained his ears for a faint, barely audible sound of crying coming from the depths of the cabin. "We are not alone anymore," Dustin said in a low voice. Night had fallen. In the silent forest of 1955, the cold of September was no longer just a physical sensation, but a pressure seeping into the deepest parts of the soul. Elias, in a moment of anger, swept his medical books onto the floor. This young man, normally orderly and controlled, seemed to be losing his mind due to the chaos created by the missing keys. "Look at me, Caleb," he hissed. His voice was muffled, his words came out with almost trembling fury. "Stop the joke. This is not a high school camp. Where are the keys?" Caleb was trying to lock the cabin door from the inside, but the old wood was swollen and the bolt wouldn't sit in place. "I swear, Elias, I put them here, right here." Caleb pounded the table. His face was whiter than Elias's. His cynical persona was gone. Dustin was in the corner, staring at the arrow in a circle symbol on the wall. His hand trembled as he took out his small pocket knife. Silently, without telling anyone, he began to scrape the moldy wood over the symbol. "What are you doing, Dustin?" Elias asked, his voice now full of threat. Dustin answered without taking his eyes off the wall. "We have to erase this. It's keeping this place open." As he scraped, a damp, sharp smell wafted from the wood. "This isn't just a superstition, it's a seal." Elias walked over to Dustin, his face bearing a mixture of horror and derision. "You and your endless nonsense, get back to the real world. This is just an old run-down cabin. We'll find the keys and leave." Dustin finally stopped. The area where the symbol had been was revealed as shining, clean wood. "It's too late, Elias. The keys aren't gone. They were taken." Caleb had lost control. He grabbed Dustin by the collar. "How do you know all this nonsense?" Dustin placed his own hand over Caleb's threatening hands. "I just know, that's all," he said after a brief pause. "Do you remember that winter 2 years ago? I went camping then." Before Dustin could finish his sentence, a thin, sharp sound was heard from the depths of the forest. It was just like the one he had heard before, but this time it was closer, clearer. It was the sound of a child crying. The three friends looked at each other. Fear instantly cut the tension between them like a knife. Elias's logic, Caleb's denial, and Dustin's intuition merged into a single feeling of panic. Caleb spoke in a choked voice. "There's a child outside," he said. His voice was cracking, and there were traces of cold sweat on his face. "Maybe a campus child got lost." Elias immediately objected. "At this hour, in this cold." Every word he spoke trembled and dispersed with the mist in the air. Dustin was sitting in a corner, pressing his hands against his knees. His breath was quickening. "That sound," he said in a low tone. "I heard it before. The same sound. It's like it wants to find us." Elias, trying to suppress his fear, picked up the gas-powered lamp. "We can't lock the door. At least let's see who's out there." As his steps creaked on the floorboards, the others instinctively lagged behind. He slowly pushed the door open. Cold and damp air rushed inside, causing Elias's hair to fly back. The dim light of the lamp could only illuminate a few meters of the forest. The darkness of the night seemed to absorb the light, extinguishing every spark as if it were alive. Elias raised the lamp a little higher. "Who's there?" he called out. The forest instantly swallowed his loud voice. He continued his questions hesitantly. Hey, are you okay? For a moment, even the wind stopped. There was no answer, only the rustling of the wind hitting the tree trunk, followed by the almost inaudible sound of a falling leaf. The crying had stopped. The forest had returned to that deadly silence. Caleb, standing behind Elias, wanted to turn around and close the door, but his hand was trembling. Maybe, he said, forcing the words out. Maybe the child is gone. No, Dustin said, pointing to the muddy ground right next to the cabin's entrance. They held the lamp down. There were delicate tracks belonging to a thin body, bare footprints. They belonged to a child. The footprints started right at the cabin's entrance and progressed deeper into the forest, toward the shadow. Elias suddenly recoiled, just like the writing on the wall. There was something strange about the footprints. The steps were moving toward the forest, but the toes were facing the cabin. It was walking backward. Caleb let out a shaky laugh. This is not possible. No one walks backward. He looked at his two friends, expecting confirmation, but they looked quite serious. No one thought this was a joke. It's definitely not an adult walking, Elias said, his voice trembling. His logic had completely abandoned his body at this point. They were facing something that medicine could not explain. The three of them quickly went inside and closed the door. They pushed the large oak cupboard, one of the few pieces of furniture filling the room, in front of the door. But it was only a psychological barrier. The door wouldn't lock. Dustin didn't believe that physical barriers could keep the thing outside away from them. Still, he continued to pile up the heaviest objects he could find against the door. That night, the tension inside the cabin reached its highest level. Elias was huddled in a corner, clutching one of his medical books like a weapon. Caleb was slumped on the edge of the table, tightly gripping the whiskey bottle he didn't dare to drink after the first glass. Dustin had gone back to the strange wall. "The boy," Dustin whispered. "The writing on the wall is about the child." "Where is my son?" Elias jumped. "Stop it, Dustin. Get a grip. You're getting paranoid." "No," Dustin countered, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "This place is doing this because of us." Elias and Caleb looked at him in astonishment. "It feeds on the rot inside us," Dustin said. "Elias, why did you drop out of medical school? Was it because you cheated on that exam? And Caleb, you took that money from loan sharks, didn't you? Didn't you use the inheritance your family left you to cover your gambling debt?" The atmosphere in the room suddenly became more intense and dangerous than the words themselves. Beneath Dustin's intuition lay the deepest moral secrets of his friends. Elias hurled the book in his hand to the floor. "Who are you to judge us? What business is it of yours about my family, my dreams? What business is it of mine?" Dustin screamed, his voice no longer a painful whisper. "That's the whole story, Elias. What I do is none of your business. Is that it? You turned your face away from me for days because I forged the last painting my mother left me, just like the buyer wanted. I'm not a fake. But you were supposed to be the savior of human life, and you crashed at the first hurdle." The two friends walked toward each other, the air between them filled with hatred. The entity mimicking the child's voice seemed to be feeding on the tension in the cabin. Caleb got up from the floor and stepped between them. "Enough. We're all messed up, okay? We've all made mistakes, but stop eating each other alive now." Just then, a sound came from the upper floor of the cabin. It was the sound of heavy, slow dragging. It was as if someone was moving very slowly on the floor above them. Elias looked up. Right in the center of the ceiling, there was a patch of dried mold. The mold patch began to grow with a red liquid. The thick liquid dripping onto the floor reminded Elias of blood. Dustin whispered in terror. He pushed Caleb and Elias toward the window in the corner of the cabin. "Don't move. Don't even breathe." The seeping red liquid began to flow quickly and dripped onto the floor. The sound of the drip shattered the surrounding silence. When the red liquid stopped, the wood around the point where it had seeped began to strain like old leather. The wood grain suddenly looked like the wrinkles of an eyelid. Then, in the center of the ceiling, where the red drop had been, a black hole, like a pupil, slowly appeared. The eye, made of red stripes, moved frantically and finally fixed on the three friends. Dustin was completely pressed against the wall as if he could pass through it. Elias tightly held Caleb's arm, staring at the eye. Fear had seeped into the souls of the three friends. They were frozen, unable to react. The wood around the eye seemed to be whispering to them. The sound resembled the rustling of dry leaves, but it came from everywhere, simultaneously. It was neither old nor young, not even entirely human. "How beautifully you suffer." A spine-chilling laugh punctuated the sentence. Elias's medical knowledge, Caleb's logic, Dustin's artistic soul, all were exhausted in that moment. All three were frozen in the dark corner of the cabin. Fear was no longer an emotion, but a physical barrier. The eye slowly closed after a while. The wood smoothed out again. The black hole shrank. The cabin groaned softly and returned to being an old, simple wooden cabin. But all three friends knew that nothing would ever be the same. Fear had used their secrets and moral conflicts as a bridge, quietly infiltrating them. Elias slowly knelt down. He lit the match in his hand and set fire to a page from one of his books. "What are you doing?" Caleb asked. His voice sounded surprised. "I know an old ritual," Elias whispered. The light from the burning page ominously illuminated his face. "This is not an ordinary cabin. I felt that something was going wrong from the moment we arrived. This is a trap. Our key is in the hands of that entity. We must stop feeding it with our quarrels." As the page caught fire and glowed with a flickering light, Elias continued, "If this place feeds on our moral decay." He quickly pressed the burning page against the wall, over the scratched words. "Then we must give it peace. We must heal it." Caleb and Dustin looked at each other, raising their eyebrows. They had not expected something like this from Elias. This young man, who always acted with logic, was now resorting to the hope of a whispered ritual. And in that moment, in that gloomy cabin of 1955, logic drew its last breath. Elias, the man who once sought scientific certainty in the field of medicine, was now burning pages under the flickering light of a match. The page he held, about abnormal pneumonia, was pressed against the "Lock the door," writing on the wall. Slowly turning black. "We've shown it that we have to suffer since we arrived," Elias whispered. His face had turned into an unrecognizable mask in the shadow of the flame. His eyes were now crazed. "Now, we must offer it salvation. A tragedy must have happened in this place. The spirit is restless." Caleb pushed the whiskey bottle on the table to the corner. He covered his mouth with his hand. His eyes widened in astonishment at Elias's new and insane determination. "A ritual? For God's sake, brother, what are we doing? Filming an Indiana Jones movie?" Dustin watched the smoke from the burning page slowly rise in the cabin. The smoke had suppressed the smell of mold and dampness, and strangely, A sweet scent began to spread. "It's working," Dustin said in a low voice. "The air feels lighter. The mold where the eye appeared, it's gone." Elias turned to Caleb. A dangerous glint shone in his eyes. "It's your turn, Caleb. Tell me, what will ease your conscience? The money you took from the loan sharks, or the story of those poor people who fell into their hands?" Caleb's face paled, his lips trembling. I just wanted to cover my debt. I would never have harmed them." "But you tainted your family's legacy," Elias countered. "This cabin loves the guilt you're feeling. What are you going to do now? Give the money back?" Caleb frantically reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded check. Bank checks were still common in those days. This was drawn from an account for the entire amount he owed the loan sharks, but it was unsigned. Elias smiled. "What started with material things must end with material things. You can't give the money back, but you can bury it in this cursed earth. Make it an offering. Get relief, Caleb." Caleb couldn't resist Elias's psychological manipulation. Fear and regret were guiding him like a puppet. He bolted outside the cabin. Elias and Dustin followed him. The moon filtered through the dense black pines, providing some light. Caleb, with a small shovel, buried the check he held right next to the door where the footprints were. As he buried the check, he quietly murmured, "I regret it. I'm giving it back. Please just go away." When he covered the earth, the forest suddenly felt lighter. The tension lifted from his shoulders like a physical burden. "Now it's your turn, Dustin," Elias said, his voice now fully reflecting the leadership of his new belief. Dustin spoke, holding his shoulder bag. "My story is simple. I forged a piece of art that wasn't mine. I stole someone else's soul. Art should be a reflection of the soul, not a copy." "And where is that fake painting?" Elias asked. "In the buyer's vault in New York," Dustin whispered. "But I have something real in my hand instead." Dustin opened his bag and took out the notebook he had started drawing in on the first day in the forest. He flipped through it quickly. The pages were filled with scary yet striking sketches inspired by the gloomy atmosphere here. Crooked trees, a child with empty eyes, and pictures of the whispers on the walls. This notebook, unlike the fake painting which is my sin, represents the truth here, Dustin said. He placed the notebook next to the spot where Caleb had buried the check. "Take it. All my art and soul. Just let us leave." The three friends stood at the cabin door, waiting for the silence of the forest. Elias's face held the expression of a fanatic who had achieved success. And then it happened. The sound of crying returned, but this time it was louder, closer, and more human-like. Right next to the left side of the cabin was a large black pine tree. Its height was so tall that it seemed to cut the sky. The sound of crying was coming from the roots of the black pine. Elias suddenly realized, this is his grave. They quickly started digging the earth with their hands. Fear and urgency gave them superhuman strength. Shovels, hands, they used whatever they could find. The cold, damp earth quickly piled up on the side. 5 minutes later, the shovel hit something hard. Wood. They dug faster. Beneath the soil, there was a small, decaying chest. A simple, handmade chest. They forced the chest out. The sound of crying seemed to be coming from inside the chest. Elias held the lamp over the chest. The hinges of the lid were rusted. Caleb and Elias forced the wooden lid open together. When it opened with a painful creak, the sound echoed throughout the forest. The inside of the chest was empty. There was only an old, yellowed and folded piece of paper. Elias took the paper with trembling hands and unfolded it. On the paper was a simple, charcoal drawing of a child. A single tear rolled down his large, sad eyes, as if the paper also felt the pain. Immediately below the drawing, a single sentence was written in clear but chilling handwriting. "They haven't felt enough of the pain they inflicted on me." Inside the wooden chest lay the wooden doll they had found on the first day in the forest, the one with the metal cross tied to his chest. Dustin screamed in horror. The chest wasn't empty before. "The boy is gone." Elias threw the paper to the ground. His eyes turned to the black pine tree. That huge old black pine looked darker, more menacing than the other trees. A new writing began to be carved into the lower part of the tree trunk. The tree was covered with a red liquid. As if a fresh wound had been opened, the three of them looked at each other in terror. Caleb was the first to find his courage. He cautiously approached the tree and wiped the red liquid with his arm. Not salvation, but rage. The three friends backed away from the black pine in horror. This sentence was carved before their eyes. What they thought was a ritual had freed the entity instead of bringing it peace. Elias, in a panic, ran to the van. He forced the door open and started searching the glove compartment and under the seat. "Don't look for the keys, Elias," Caleb shouted from behind him. Elias replied, "No, there's something else." In Elias's medical bag, hidden beneath the other books, there was a small, old leather case. He pulled out the case. Inside was the silver razor his father had given him as a graduation gift. He hadn't touched the razor since the moment he decided to cheat on his last exam. Elias slowly pulled the sharp instrument out of its case. The cold, shiny surface of the metal glimmered eerily under the moonlight. "What are you going to do with that razor?" Dustin asked, his voice almost as thin and fragile as a whisper. Elias looked at the shiny surface of the instrument in his hand, seeing the striking intersection of his own destiny and the entity in the forest. "You can't heal others by inflicting pain without inflicting pain on yourself," Elias said. His voice was no longer his own. It struck their ears like a deep alien echo that raised goosebumps. He tightly gripped the razor in his hand. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and started walking toward the black pine tree. Every step he took intensified the air in the silent forest, his silhouette merging with the darkness of the night. Elias was moving toward an action that would seal the fate of both himself and his friends on that terrifying September night of 1955. Caleb and Dustin were frozen behind him. Fear had gone beyond panic, giving their bodies a paralyzing numbness. They no longer recognized the Elias they had grown up with. A person couldn't change this much in one night. This was unnatural. Their eyes were fixed on the sharp instrument in Elias's hand. They didn't know what he was going to do with it. The wind blew softly. The branches of the black pine rustled silently, making the tree's shadow even more colossal and terrifying. Elias slowly reached the base of the tree. The dark thoughts inside him, combined with the cold surface of the metal, created a new weight. It would drag both his own soul and his friends into the middle of a kind of test. He paused for a moment. He took a deep breath. Along with the trembling in his hands, the silence now filled the night like a shield of tension. Caleb drew the only weapon he used to lighten tense situations. "Dude, put that down. Are you going to write a message on the tree with it? I'm sure the ghost doesn't enjoy letter writing much." This time, his sarcastic voice didn't make anyone laugh. Elias slowly turned his crazed gaze toward Caleb. "Yes, I will write him a message. The black pine was denser and older than the other trees. Its roots had embraced the chest where the child was buried for years, becoming the guardian of the dark secret. Elias took a deep breath. "It's not the spirit's restlessness that's keeping us here," he whispered, his voice mingling with the wind. "What's keeping us is that child's desire to see us suffer." Elias would use the knowledge he gained in medical school in this final, twisted ritual. By exceeding his own pain threshold, he would offer a final feast to that paranormal entity. He tightly gripped the razor in his right hand. His eyes were closed. First slowly, then quickly, he brought the sharp tip down onto the inner surface of his left arm. The cut was deep and clean. Red, warm blood began to drip onto the black trunk of the black pine. Elias's face was contorted with pain, but not a single groan escaped his mouth. Dustin threw the lantern in his hand to the ground and ran to his friend. "Okay, that's enough. We're walking back if we have to." Elias silently watched his blood collecting at the root of the tree. Caleb was frozen. This was the last thing he expected. "Caleb, snap out of it," Dustin yelled. "Find some fabric somewhere. Hurry! We have to wrap his arm." As the blood dripped onto the ground, the air around them suddenly warmed up. The cold that enveloped the cabin and the forest gave way to an intense, suffocating heat. Elias, without letting go of the razor, gripped the trunk of the black pine with his bloody hand. The whispers returned, but this time not from the walls, but from inside the tree. It was as if thousands of pine needles were saying something simultaneously. "Father. Peace. See me." The blood continued to flow. Elias's face was as white as a sheet. Caleb finally broke free from the shock and rushed toward Elias with a piece he tore from his t-shirt. "Elias, stop. You're losing blood." When Caleb tried to grab Elias's arm, Elias violently pushed him away. "No!" Elias shouted, his voice filled with animalistic desperation. "Leave me alone. He wants to see the truth. Let's accept our own pain." At the peak of his pain, Elias slowly offered the silver razor to Caleb. His hand was covered in blood. "Your turn, Caleb. You didn't just steal the money. You stole our honesty and innocence. Now give it back. Suffer. Pay your debt." Caleb stepped back in terror. His heart pounded rapidly in his chest, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He refused to harm himself, but his eyes were locked on the blood-covered metal razor in Elias's hand. Every reflection shimmered like a nightmare in the darkness of the night. "Elias, you're not yourself," Caleb whispered, his voice shaky and helpless. All the muscles in his body were tense, his breathing ragged and broken. "You're scaring me more than the fucking ghost." His words hung in the air. The silence in the forest was so intense and heavy for a moment that even breathing became terrifying. Caleb's eyes were fixed on the trembling razor, fluctuating between panic and terror. He didn't want to harm himself, but he couldn't help but think that this was his only option. Just then, a movement appeared in the cabin window. The curtain covering the cracked glass swayed slightly inside. A silhouette passed in front of the fabric, illuminated by the fireplace light. Caleb flinched. His heart began to beat even faster. What is that?" he mumbled, his voice almost inaudible. The darkness outside suddenly brightened with the moonlight hitting the window glass, then plunged back into total darkness. It was then that Dustin realized the feeling of being watched in the cabin wasn't just an illusion. The entity they thought was outside could enter all along. Dustin trembled silently behind Elias. He squinted his eyes, following the strange movement in the window. The thing inside was running around frantically, It was throwing objects it passed into the air, as if searching for something it had lost. He now understood the reason for the backward footprints they had seen in front of the door. That figure, which resembled a human, was moving in reverse. It occasionally leaped to the ceiling, then crashed to the floor. Each descent and jump made the silence in the cabin more suffocating and chilling. Elias still hadn't let go of the sharp instrument. He approached the window. His shadow, reflected by the moonlight, merged with the movement of the curtain, forming a larger, more terrifying figure. Now, all three were at the bottom of the window, watching the movement inside. Caleb, at that moment, began to doubt both his own sanity and reality. "Do you see what I see?" He looked at his friends and pointed to the cabin. "That thing is inside. It's going upstairs." Dustin spoke without taking his eyes off the curtain. "It's been watching us in the cabin from the very beginning." Caleb screamed in horror. "I'm leaving here. Whoever wants to can come." The figure walking upstairs suddenly stopped. It slowly turned its head toward Caleb. Then its body bent unnaturally at the waist. It raised its arms to the sides and dropped to the floor. It ran on all fours toward the window. Caleb wet himself. All three of them took a step back. They couldn't take their eyes off the curtain. As the figure approached the window, it became invisible. Everyone looked at each other. Dustin took a step forward, approaching to look inside to see where the shadow was. After a brief look inside, he turned his head to his friends. "It's gone." With an ear-splitting scream, the shadow clung to the glass. The cracked glass shattered completely. The ghost wrapped its distorted hand around Dustin's throat. Caleb was screaming as Dustin's feet left the ground, and he struggled in the air. The struggling young man reached out his hand to his friends, asking for help. Elias swung the razor at the ghost. The sharp tip passed through the transparent body. It couldn't hurt it. "Stop. I did what you wanted." He lifted his bloody wrist toward the ghost. "Look, I suffered, just like you." The ghost turned its hollow eyes to Elias's bleeding arm. The child seemed to be feeding on Elias's blood, but it wasn't enough. The clothes on him were 1950s fashion overalls, but they were covered in dirt. The little boy slowly smiled in a reverse manner. Then, the whispers changed. The voice from the tree was no longer the voice of a suffering child. It was a deep, echoing, adult voice. "Where is my son?" This was the same sentence written on the wall. Caleb and Elias were crushed under the weight of the new threat. This was not just the ghost of a child. This was the child's father. And that father was looking for his son. The ghost found his new target and threw Dustin to the ground. Dustin fell to his knees and crawled backward with rattling breaths. His drawing notebook, which he had thrown to the ground right next to the black pine, hit his hand, and he turned his head. As he flipped through the pages of the notebook, he saw the child figure he had drawn earlier. "Father," Dustin shouted, his voice trembling with panic. "Your son was here. He was in the chest. They buried him to bring him peace." Dustin quickly pressed the drawing notebook and the paper drawing of the child against the freshly carved writing on the black pine's trunk. "Do you want to see him? Here is your son. Look at the falseness of my art, the price of my sin, right here." Dustin was performing the ritual of confessing his guilt, just as Elias had done. He was combining the confession of his own sin with the child's memory. The ghost scream stopped. The forest returned to its former silence. It slowly turned its crooked head toward the black pine. It was as if it was hearing its son's voice for the first time. Then, all the windows of the house quietly exploded. From the inside out, The pieces scattered on the ground with a great noise, but there were no footprints where the glass had fallen. Emptiness. The ghost was gone. The forest returned to its natural noise. The unnatural coldness, the heavy air covering the moonlight, the whispering sounds, all had disappeared. Elias staggered from pain and blood loss. Caleb quickly caught Elias. In a panic, he began pressing fabric onto the cut on Elias's arm. "The cabin! The bag! First aid!" Caleb shouted. Dustin ran to the cabin with trembling legs. He stepped on the broken glass and went inside. On the table, next to the medical books, right under the lamp, were the van keys, as if they had never been lost. Dustin grabbed the keys. As he turned back, the wooden doll that Caleb had found with him that day was on the table, its cross untied and its eyes closed. Caleb carried the bleeding Elias to the van. Dustin quickly got behind the wheel. The engine started on the first try. Dustin accelerated on that dusty road. The van quickly sped away from the gloomy cabin, the black pine, and the heavy silence of the forest they left behind. In the rearview mirror of the car, just before the cabin and the black pine disappeared from view at the last bend of the wooded area, something flashed for a moment. Was it a small figure standing by the window, waving, or just a final trick of the light? Dustin looked into the rearview mirror one last time. His eyes turned to Elias's wounded arm. "Did we escape?" Caleb whispered, his voice tired and exhausted. "We escaped," Dustin said. But all three friends knew that they would never fully escape that autumn of 1955. The silent forest, the cursed cabin, and that moral test.